Hello, this is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I'm going to look at World Schools debate. Specifically, I'm going to examine the speaker roles and responsibilities of the individuals who participate in the debate, and we'll break that down into two separate parts. First, some general thoughts about how to approach your speeches and what those speeches should include, and then second, the specific tasks that each of the debaters need to fulfill during their speeches. So let's look at some of those general ideas. We are all familiar with Aristotle's elements of persuasion: logos, ethos, and pathos. We know that in American formats of debate, most American formats of debate, we primarily concern ourselves with logos, the logical construction of our ideas. Are those arguments true? Are they valid? How do we construct them in such a way that they make sense? And then we engage in our opponent's ideas. We know that the vast majority of judges in American formats of debate are primarily concerned with what happens on the flow, not necessarily with how we present our ideas. But in international debating, we find that our judges are looking at the bigger picture. They want to see all of the elements of persuasion taking place, because we tend to think of international debating as debaters who are presenting their ideas in a way that are palatable to the common person, to the everyday individual. And we want to make sure that whoever is listening to this debate, whoever is listening to our ideas, is going to A, understand those arguments, but B, is also going to be persuaded by them. And so we need to incorporate all three elements of Aristotle's elements of persuasion. So do all of the things that you already do in the other formats of debate that you already participate in. Construct sound arguments. Scaffold those arguments in a way that judges can understand them and make sense of them, and you want to engage your opponent's ideas. But then you also want to make sure that you are using those other two elements, ethos and pathos. In terms of pathos, a true understanding of pathos is the idea that the audience feels that you have their interests at heart. In policy debate, we primarily accomplish this goal by simply adapting to the judging paradigm of our critic. But what we do in international formats of debate is we highlight the principles or the goals that we're trying to uphold, or things that we think that people actually care about, and we use that as an umbrella underneath our argument, whether it be equality, fairness, justice, you name it. You can actually take a page from Lincoln-Douglas debate in order to create this sense of what it is that's important, and that it's something that rings true to the listener, to the judge. But then you also want to make sure that you are a credible speaker, that you have the elements of ethos. So you want to have all of the elements that you think of being a persuasive speaker, of being a good public speaker. You want to enunciate clearly. You want to use pacing in your speech to draw your audience in. You don't want to speak too quickly for them. You don't want to leave them behind. You want to accelerate your language in a way that it builds an intensity and draws the audience in at key elements of your speech. You want to change the volume, you want to change the pitch. All of those things that you do as a good and credible speaker, you want to do in international debating or in World Schools debate. So don't forget about those other elements. Make sure that you are incorporating them into your speech. Second, or in addition to that, you also want to think about, what does a public speech look like? When you create an original oratory or a U.S. extemporaneous speech or an international extemporaneous speech, you are very familiar with the process of building a cohesive speech. You have an introduction which has an attention getter, which draws your audience in. You frame that speech around something important. You provide the audience with a thesis statement. You preview the points that you're going to discuss in your speech. You want to have all of the elements of a good introduction in your World Schools debate speech. Then you delve into the body of the speech. You deconstruct the previous speaker if there was one. You construct your arguments in 2 or 3 main points, or rebuild your arguments depending on which speaker you are, and then you have a clear conclusion at the end of your speech. You don't just deal with the line by line like a policy debater or a Lincoln-Douglas debater or a public forum debater might do. You want an intro, a body, and a conclusion. You want to make sure that you're wrapping up the speech, that it's encapsulated in that framing both through the introduction and the conclusion, so that the judge can digest the material more easily, can understand it, can see how all of this material that you presented them with fits into the debate round. Okay, so let's look at the specific speeches and the things that you are going to need to accomplish during each of your speeches. The first speaker from the proposition team, the very first speech in a World Schools debate round, is going to do two things. One, they're going to provide a model, something that helps the judge understand what the debate is about. And the model is really driven by the motion that was written, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But then the second thing you do is you want to provide one or two justifications for the resolution or for the motion, one or two arguments in favor of the topic that you have been assigned to debate. So, an effective opening proposition speaker is going to be a controversial speaker. You're going to look at the motion that was presented, you're going to embrace that controversy, and you're going to jump in head first with it. You want to be memorable by showing that you actually are committed to whatever language the judges wrote when they, or excuse me, the adjudication court came up with when they wrote the motion. In an American format of debate, such as policy debate, you sometimes might get rewarded if you're confronted with a controversial topic, if you can narrow the topic down to a small slice or a sliver of that topic, which isn't as controversial, so that there aren't a lot of disadvantages to be run against that argument. But in international formats of debate, we want to see that you're jumping into the actual controversy. You're saying, yes, I know I've been assigned a motion or I've been given a stance which is going to be difficult to prove, but I'm going to attempt to prove that case. And that's how you make yourself memorable. You jump into the controversy. And a lot of times, judges on the international scene don't necessarily judge the debate on was the motion proven true or false, like we would in a policy or Lincoln Douglas debate round, where we say this team proved that that the motion is a good idea. In World Schools debate or international formats of debate, we're thinking about movement along the scale of whether or not it's a good idea. So if you have been given a stance which we know to be unethical or generally is frowned upon in the international community or in the United States, if you can start to help us to understand why that might be an acceptable position, you're going to be rewarded for that. Think about it in terms of like student congress. In congressional debate, the winner of any congressional debate round might not be the one who proved that a piece of legislation was a good idea, but the debater who did the best job of advocating for their case. That's ultimately what you're looking at in an international format of debate. Who did the best job to prove their case, regardless of whether or not you necessarily won the debate, so to speak. You're also going to be effective if you go on the offensive, and that's really true of any format of debate. The more time you spend in your speech arguing from a position of defense, saying, well, they're going to argue this and we can protect ourselves against this, I'm going to preempt an argument by doing this, that doesn't really get you very far. You want to go out on the offensive and say, look, these are the bad things that happen right now, or these are the negative repercussions of the status quo's approach, and that's why we need to change our stance. That's why we need to do something different. Show us what good is going to come from your perspective, from your efforts to embrace the resolution. And then again, you are rewarded for proving the harder case. A lot of times if you come in and you've been given a debate topic, say banning tobacco products, it would be very easy to talk about the harmful health effects. That's not really a controversial stance. That's not something that takes a lot of effort to prove. That's what we would think of as low-hanging fruit. You would be much better off going after the harder case, looking at something that's more difficult to prove, something that's more an aspect that maybe doesn't get a whole lot of attention in the media and so forth, something that's going to be a lot harder to prove. That doesn't mean that you ignore the health effects in that particular debate, because certainly that's going to help your side, but you want to go after a more difficult case to prove and show how that actually works in your favor. Okay, so the first speaker can sometimes be referred to as the Prime Minister, the person introducing us to the debate. That individual is going to define the debate for us, and this is where you provide a model for the motion that was provided. And when we're talking about defining the debate, we're talking about defining what the controversy actually is. And so you can provide a model of the debate, and there are several different ways that you can do that. One is to provide a conceptual model to help us to understand what we're actually debating versus what we're not debating. So, for instance, if we were talking about a motion that dealt with banning cosmetic surgery, a conceptual model would say, look, we're not talking about things that are necessary for life-saving, such as skin grafts following for a burn victim or something like that. We're talking about banning things, or we're talking about embracing things like breast augmentation, nose jobs, eye lifts, those types of things. That's what we're actually talking about. We're not talking about these other things, which wouldn't really be all that controversial, okay? So that would be a conceptual model to help us to understand what it is that we're debating about. The second type of a model is a policy model. This is what you do in policy debate. You give us a plain text. And so one thing that a prime minister could do is they could actually look at the motion and say, this is the way this motion would be implemented. This is the agency that would carry it out. These are the things that they would enact, the things that they wouldn't enact, and so forth. And so you incorporate some of that conceptual modeling, but you frame it specifically in the context of what a government agency would actually do. And then after you have modeled the debate for us, after you've defined the debate for us, then you introduce 1 to 2 winning arguments. You can offer pragmatic arguments that would simply be done like a policy debate case would, where you say, look, these are the harms that are happening in the status quo. This is how our proposal, this is how the motion actually solves those problems. This is how we fix the problem. It could be a principled argument. This is what you do in Lincoln-Douglas debate. You could say that these are the types of goals, or these are the goals that we usually try to achieve, that we work towards, and that's how we're going to frame the debate. We want to achieve justice. We want to achieve equality in our society, and so forth. So to look specifically into mock debate round that might happen, or a hypothetical debate that might happen, we could say this House supports the use of corporal punishment. And the first prop speaker is going to frame this debate around 2 central issues, that of education and personal safety. So the debater might come in and provide us a specific model that says we're going to reinstate corporal punishment in schools when a student uses violence against another student. Okay, so inherent in that, we've limited the scope of the topic a little bit. We're not going to use corporal punishment, spankings, or smacking hands with bamboo sticks, I don't know. We're not going to do that for minor misconduct in the classroom. We're going to do it only in those instances when a student has used violence against another student. This model is further narrowed down by, or further specified by saying that it's not conducted by the classroom teacher. The individual who witnessed the infraction is not going to turn around and spank whatever student did this. It's going to be, you're going to have a referral process to the office. It will be investigated, and then if necessary, or if it's determined that it is appropriate, then you would use corporal punishment. So that's the model that the first proposition speaker has presented us with. Then they give us 2 separate justifications for the motion, or for their specific model. One, they tell us that we want to ensure a safe learning environment, that our schools are about creating a safe learning environment. We want to ensure that students can actually be in a safe space so that they're in the right frame of mind in order to learn. And we need these types of threats, these types of punishments out there in order to create an environment in which we can have a safe learning environment. And you do that through elements of deterrence, that you are deterring these actions. That creates the safe environment. Students feel safe at school and they can learn. That allows the teachers and the students to focus on learning outcomes. Second, they give us a justification that says that we need to promote student safety. We are the teachers, we are the administrators who are tasked with taking care of students throughout the day. We've got the students for 6, 7, 8 hours during the day. We need to ensure their safety. That's part of our responsibilities as educators. And so we are going to promote an environment which is safe for students. So then we move into the first opposition speaker. The first opposition speaker will do a couple of things. One, they will reframe the debate, and 2, the speaker will introduce 1 to 2 justifications for opposing the topic. So in terms of reframing the debate, there are 2 things that happen. One, the speaker may need to challenge the definition that was provided by the first prop speaker. This is rare in international formats of debate, that you would challenge the government's or the proposition team's interpretation of the motion. Why? Because debaters in international formats are encouraged to embrace the controversy, so you don't generally run into situations where you have non-topical cases. You have people who are actually debating the topic, but every once in a while you might need to challenge the definition. The second thing that you do to reframe the debate is simply by identifying the counter-advocacy. And by that I mean they're arguing for change, we are the status quo, or we are a countermodel, also known as counterplan in policy debate circles. So what happens when you challenge a definition? Again, it's extremely rare that you need to challenge the definition because proposition teams are usually going to embrace the controversy. And we don't really get into lengthy topicality debates in international debating. But there are three scenarios that I think can help illuminate or help us to understand when and how you would challenge a definition. The first scenario is one in which the proposition team, the first speaker from proposition, has given us both an incorrect understanding of the motion and an unfair understanding of the motion. So take, for example, a topic that says, this House believes that torture is a legitimate tool in the war on terrorism. I once watched a debate round in which the first speaker from this was actually a British parliamentary debate round, where the first speaker, the Prime Minister, stood up and said that we are going to deny suspects in the war on terror access to pen and paper while they are being withheld, while they are detained. They will not be able to write their memoirs, they will not be able to write letters to their loved ones at home, and so forth. That was their definition of the debate. That was the model that they provided. Clearly, that's an incorrect understanding. The heart of this debate topic is about torture. We know what torture is. Withholding pen and paper probably isn't it. It's also an unfair interpretation of the motion because it's a very difficult case to defend against. There isn't a whole lot of ground for giving disadvantages or for running disadvantages against this case. So in this particular scenario, the first speaker from the opposition stood up and basically just said, that's an interesting understanding of the motion. When I heard this debate topic announced, I thought we were going to talk about things like waterboarding, bamboo shoots underneath people's fingernails, and things of that nature, not withholding pen and paper. We all know what torture really is. Let's move this debate back to where it belongs. That's all the first speaker said in terms of challenging the definition. Highlighted the absurdity of the Prime Minister's stance, grounded the debate in what it was actually about, and then proceeded to run a case against torture itself. You don't have a lengthy topicality debate. The judging panel simply evaluated the round and said, yep, we know what torture is. Now we're back to talking about what we're supposed to talk about. But then you also have an incorrect interpretation of a motion that is a fair interpretation, or a fair debate, I guess is what I should say. So take, for example, a motion that says, this House would ban smoking. The first speaker from proposition stands up and says, we are going to ban all aspects of the supply chain and consumption chain of the tobacco industry. We will make it illegal to grow tobacco. We will make it illegal to process tobacco products. We will make it illegal to transport tobacco products. We will make it illegal to sell tobacco products, and we will make it illegal to consume tobacco products. Okay? That model is clearly an incorrect understanding of the motion. If you were in a policy debate round, you would say there's a whole lot of extra topical stuff going on, because they're not just limiting this to smoking. Okay, we're not just talking about cigarettes and pipes and cigars. We're also talking about smokeless tobacco. We're also talking about more than just simply banning the act of smoking. Okay, we've also banned the production of those tobacco products. So all of that is actually an incorrect understanding of the motion. But it's also a very fair debate, because honestly, not only is it incorrect, but I could come in now and I have a lot more potential offense. Yes, they have more potential benefits of their plan, but I also have bigger links to the arguments that I might want to run as to why this would be a bad idea. So what do you do in this situation? Honestly, ignore it. Don't even mention that your opponents had an incorrect understanding of the motion or doing something more than what they were supposed to. Just debate their case. A third scenario. They have an incorrect interpretation and it's debatably fair. So take, for example, this House believes that all nations have a right to nuclear weapons. Let's say that you've been assigned this motion and your Prime Minister stands up and runs a case that says all democratic governments, all democratic societies, or Western liberal democracies have a right to nuclear weapons, and they build their case around that model. Clearly, that's an incorrect interpretation of the motion, because Western liberal democracies are not all nations. It's debatably fair, though, because you can have a lot of debate about whether or not that's a good idea, both in terms of should Western liberal democracies have a right to nuclear weapons, and what are the ramifications of saying only Western liberal democracies have a right to nuclear weapons. Okay, so it's debatably fair. So what do you do in that instance? Well, in this instance, you probably point out the incorrect interpretation and say, that's very interesting. The motion says that the proposition team was tasked with defending all nations have a right to nuclear weapons, but in constructing their case, they limited it down to only Western liberal democracies. They did not truly embrace the motion itself. In doing so, they have probably disproven the resolution that all nations have a right to nuclear weapons. But we're going to debate the case that they presented anyway and tell you why it's not a good idea for Western liberal democracies to have a right to nuclear weapons. So what have you done in this instance? You've pointed out the incorrect interpretation, which makes sure that the judging panel is listening to you and going, okay, they've changed the ground of the debate a little bit. They haven't necessarily proven their case. That puts you in a difficult spot because you didn't have predictability during your preparation time. So I'll take that into account while we're debating. Second, you've also pointed out to me how that actually undermines their case, or that undermines their case's ability to prove the resolution true. So that's your first argument against their case in a substantive manner. But then third, you just engage the debate. So that's challenging the definition. Now you also want to provide a counter advocacy. You want to make sure that you are defending something specific in the debate round. You want to be explicit in what you are debating. That makes sure that both sides are clear about what you're debating. It also makes sure that the judge understands what the different courses of action or what the different perspectives to be evaluated are. So that's, again, the model presented by the proposition team versus the status quo or a counter model. Again, method 1, defend the status quo. Method 2, provide a counter plan or a counter model. Tell us what alternative action is going to be engaged in or pursued. And a third counter advocacy is simply to provide an alternate goal. The proposition has given us the goal of security or protecting lives, saving lives. We give you an alternative goal of justice. Okay, once you have redefined the debate and you have identified your counter advocacy, the next step is for you to engage in an element of deconstruction. You want to engage your opponent's arguments. So whatever 1 to 2 justifications that your opponents gave, you're going to want to engage those ideas. Now, unlike most American formats of debate, you do not need to spend a lot of time going through a lot of line-by-line analysis, disagreeing with each and every point. Rather, you want to look at the big picture and undermine your opponent's idea by identifying the 1 or 2 weakest links in their perspective. If you can look at an assumption that their case was built on and then target that assumption and tear down that assumption and show why that means that their entire argument crumbles, you would be rewarded for doing that. You don't need to go through and give me 15 reasons why their argument is wrong. You really just need to give me a single really good reason why their argument is incorrect. So again, you attack the weaknesses in their arguments. If they have inaccurate statements, if there are tenuous relationships between the ideas that they've built up, if their arguments are built on flawed assumptions and so forth. Again, you're thinking about the big picture. You're not necessarily dealing with the nitty-gritty line-by-line type debating. Then you want to introduce 1 to 2 of your own arguments. There are 4 different ways that you can do that, or four different types of arguments that you might provide for your 1 to 2 arguments. One would be contravention. This, in policy language, is a turn. You want to show that instead of achieving their goal, they're actually making things worse. The second type is an unintended consequence, that if we pursue this course of action, it actually leads to some other negative reaction. That would be a disadvantage. Type 3 is an opportunity cost. If we pursue this course of action, we lose the opportunity to do something else. That would be your counterplan and the benefits of that counter model. Type 4 is an alternate goal. They pursue security. Justice is a more important virtue or a more important goal or a better goal that we should achieve. Construct your arguments around one or two of those different types of arguments. So, in practice, if we go back to our hypothetical debate of this House supports the use of corporal punishment, our first opposition speaker might give us the overarching frame or counter-advocacy of social welfare, societal welfare. Rather than pursuing goals of education and personal safety, we want societal welfare, what's good for all of society. So this speaker then is going to deconstruct a little bit along the lines of efficacy or solvency attacks, saying that your ability to actually create a safe learning environment is actually undermined by the fact that your use of corporal punishment is not done immediately. There's a separation between when this act of violence against another student occurred, when you have the referral, the investigation, and then you turn around and you smack that student or whatever. There's a lack of immediate reaction, which means that it's not necessarily going to be present in the student's mind why they're actually being attacked by the system. Second, it creates a fear of the school, right? That when you have administrators who are dishing out corporal punishment, instead of creating a safe learning environment, you actually have students who start fearing the administration, fearing coming to school, and so forth. And so you don't actually create the safe learning environment and the safe environment that the proposition was trying to achieve. Then they move into their own constructive responses or their own constructive argumentation and simply crafts an argument around an idea of cycle of violence. That when you use violence as a form of punishment, it sends the message that violence is okay, that violence is good, that it becomes a normalizing factor. And that also it takes place when there is a power relationship or a power, when there's a different level of power between the individuals, that whoever is stronger, whoever is bigger, whoever is in the place of importance is the one who has the right to dispense with those types of violent punishments. Okay, so it reinforces this idea of the stronger individual, the more important individual, whatever, has the right to do this. So it creates this imbalance in power relationships. And then this can play out in scenarios of domestic violence later on. So that's the opposition team's line of argument coming out of the first speaker. So what does the second speaker do then? The second speakers from both teams have two primary responsibilities. They need to engage the previous speaker, which is going to be deconstructing the arguments put forth by their opponents, the main argument that was put out by their opponent, but also the second speaker is going to need to do a little bit of engagement with rebuilding, because there was the first opposition speaker, for example, deconstructed the first speaker's case, so you need to engage with that deconstruction and rebuild as well. But then second, you want to provide an extension to the debate. You want to provide something new to the debate, a new argument to the debate. So, the paradox of the second speaker is that you both need to support the first speaker, you need to work in favor of that individual, but you also need to create arguments that are distinct from the first speaker. Add something new to the debate. So how do you do that? Well, effective extensions add significant value to the discussion, but it's still in the spirit of the first speaker's material. You want to create an additional identity, and you can do that best by simply creating a new argument in the debate round. Like I said, the types of extensions: first, a new line of argument, which would be a new disadvantage, a new advantage. That's one way of doing it. It could be if everything in the debate from your side of the debate was pragmatic in nature, now you might add a philosophical or a principled argument to the debate. Or you might just add depth by providing real-world application. Maybe the first speaker talked about things in the theoretical, and now you're going to apply it to a case study somewhere in the world so that we can see how it actually plays out in that type of specificity or that type of specificity. You might also complete an argument. If you know that the first speaker didn't completely fill in all of the gaps, you might simply add to the depth and understanding by filling in some of those gaps. So, some examples of extensions. If we had the motion, "This House would prohibit the adoption of Chinese children by foreign citizens," the first proposition speaker might build their argument around the idea that it treats children, that this adoption, foreign adoptions, treats children as a commodity. In effect, you're selling children to foreigners, it's created a black market for children, and we also have increased corruption of local government agencies. So an option for an extension might be that of the value of Chinese culture. The implications on children when they are being sent overseas to foreign cultures, foreign lands, that they lose connection to Chinese culture, they've lost their heritage when this happens, and that it also harms China's image in the world. It devalues the image of China, which has negative ramifications in terms of how people perceive Chinese culture. That's one option for an extension. A second would be develop one aspect of the first prop speaker argument. Why did it create a black market, for example? Examine a specific province in China, look at some of the statistics, some of the things that have happened, and demonstrate how the model will actually bring about positive change or resolve the problems of the status quo. So those are two different extensions that a second speaker could provide. To take it back to our hypothetical debate on corporal punishment, the second prop speaker may add to the debate by diverging from the education and personal safety aspects and talking specifically about justice. Now, first, there needs to be some deconstruction in terms of the cycle of violence argument that the first op speaker provided. They're going to look at how this is an option of last resort. And we're not necessarily, going to spank every single child all of the time. That's ridiculous. We're only going to use it in the most egregious of circumstances. And second, we do this in our own society. We have physical punishments for breaking laws all of the time. Why is this any different? Which transitions into the constructive material of justice. This justice is the foundation of modern society. It is the building block of our societies and so forth. And by incorporating these elements of referral and investigation and doling out punishments, we're institutionalizing the idea of justice and building respect for those types of institutions in our society. And that ultimately culminates in responsible citizenship. In terms of the second opposition speaker, extending upon the partner's remarks on societal welfare, this individual brings up the idea or the extension material of a fight or flight mentality. Of course, there's deconstruction. First of all, that there are some flawed assumptions that the previous speaker was assuming that these types of physical punishments are good at the national level for adults too. And second, that there are only minimal gains in safety and learning outcomes, that we're not having huge advantages. So don't let the proposition team fool you by saying that all of a sudden our schools are going to be completely safe and all of those sorts of things. There are really only minimal gains taking place. Then in terms of the constructive argumentation, this individual is going to bring up a lot of social psychology. First main point is the perpetuation of violence. Might look at behaviorists like B.F. Skinner and talking about how reinforcement principles actually lead to more of those same types of responses. And violence then becomes second nature for our students, both in terms of how they interpret whether or not violence should be doled out, but also when it should be administered as well. Second, the idea of instilling fear. You could use Watson's white rat experiments, where it showed white rats to children babies while playing really loud noises. The babies cried, they removed the sounds, and then when the rats came in, the white rats came in, the babies still cried because they associated the rats with those negative, scary things. And so then you talk about how this instills fear in our students because they see the administration as something to be feared, and it doesn't matter whether or not they're actually doing good things for them or helping them and whatnot. They have already created this situation where they become fearful of the school. That leads to them shutting down and not engaging in the system, not engaging with their teachers. So you not only have this cycle of violence taking place, you're not achieving your goals of justice, you're not achieving your safe learning environment, and so forth. And then that brings us to our third speakers. The third speakers have two responsibilities: deconstruct the speakers who came before them and reconstruct both of their partners' material, rebuild both of their partners' material. So what are the third prop and third opposition speakers going to do? They are going to engage in some framing in the debate. They're going to compare and contrast the efforts of all four of the preceding speakers in relation to the motion, their efforts in relation to the motion. What are the burdens of the motion? What were they tasked to debate? What was the debate defined as, and how did we engage one another on each of those issues? Then they're going to deconstruct, like I said, the previous speaker, and then rebuild their cases, and perhaps add more depth to those arguments as well. Already talked about deconstructing the previous speaker. How do you add depth at this point in the debate? The first method is to simply go deep on the argumentation that was already presented. You have had each of the speakers on your side of the bench, on your teammates, have given us 1 to 2 justifications for the motion. You're going to look at each of those in turn and add more depth, more nuance, more understanding to those ideas. There are 2 other methods that you can engage in, though. Balancing and the nature of. Balancing is simply a method of looking at the debate and saying, look, our government's responsibility is to balance the interests of all of the stakeholders in various controversies, to look at the big picture and make adjudications, make determinations on what is in the best interest of society at large. And so then you would frame your speech around the idea of what is the responsibility of government. It's to balance the interests and intentions of the various stakeholders. Second, you would identify what the interests of all of the stakeholders are. And then third, you would show through the arguments that came from your first and second speaker how your side of the motion best balances the interests of the parties who care about this debate topic. Method number 3 is a nature of. This could be the nature of government and balancing, or it could be what is the nature of justice? What does it truly mean to be a just society? How do we know when we've achieved that just society? And now you capture the various arguments that were presented on both sides of the debate underneath those conceptions of justice, underneath those notions of justice. So you add depth by simply framing the debate in a unique way. You could add depth to the debate if everyone else has talked about things in the theoretical. You could now play things out in the practical world, or if everyone else has talked about the pragmatic, the real world impacts, now you might pull things back a little bit and talk about the theoretical perspectives, why we know it to be true, why people behave the way they do, why governments behave the way they do, and so forth. So again, you're just adding a twist, a little bit of nuance to the way that we understand the debate that has already taken place. So, to go back to our corporal punishment example, the third proposition speaker might deconstruct by saying, hey, look, if we solve violence early, all of your perpetuation of violence impacts don't really happen. If we nip it in the bud now, we don't really have this institutionalizing of fear taking place. Then the individual has a first main point, or a first area of analysis, talking about ensuring safe learning environment, saying, look, we have dire circumstances right now, talk about the violence, school shootings, bullying, all of those types of things that are there, why we need to act, why we need to change how we do business. And then follow that up by talking about how schools build relationships first, that in the modern era, teachers and administrators build relationships with their students. They're not simply this far off, out of touch individual who's an authoritarian looking down on everyone else. They are building a community first, and then they would use corporal punishment. So you wouldn't necessarily have this fear that the opposition is trying to sell you on. Second constructive point would be talking about societal benefit. Again, the dire circumstances and the roles of schools. Why do schools really exist? Our schools exist to develop responsible citizens, to grow engaged citizens. It's not just to instill book knowledge and things like that. We're trying to do more. By having this type of construction of the third proposition speech, you're encapsulating all of the arguments presented by the first and second speaker within those two areas of analysis and adding a little bit of depth. Now the third opposition speaker comes in and deconstructs and says, look, again, you've got the minimal gains and safety learning outcomes, and then in terms of construction might engage in the balancing strategy that I talked about. What is the role of government? The role of the government is to balance the interests and intentions of the various stakeholders. Second, who are those stakeholders and what are their interests? And you might break it down along faculty, students, and society and talk about what the goals for each of those three stakeholders are. And then third, you talk about the balancing interests. Show how the faculty, students, and society are impacted by the proposition world, how they're impacted by the opposition world, and then conclude by showing why it's the opposition worldview, which is actually the one that best serves the interests of all. Then we come to the final rebuttal speaker, the whip speakers. The role of the whip is to conclude any unfinished debate that's out there. Hopefully there isn't much unfinished debate at this point, since we only have a 4-minute speech. But you're then summarizing the round, and you're framing the debate. You're giving the judge a clear reason to vote for your team in the debate round. So effective summaries, how do you build them? The first step is to identify the proposition. What is it that we were actually debating about? What did we debate about in this round? That's your first step. You want to think about that and write it down on a piece of paper. What is it that we're debating about? Step 2, identify the issues that we debated about. So you have the big picture idea of what we're debating about, but then in terms of that big idea, we know that the debate played out in a number of different ways, whether it be economics and public health and rights. We have 3 separate issues, for example, that we debated. So you identify what those 3 issues are. Then you posit the central questions, or posit central questions to steps 1 and step 2. So you frame the answers to the step 1 and step 2 identification as questions. Step 3, you then determine the winner of each of those issues. Which team won those issues and why? Step 4, determine the importance of each of those issues in the round. If we had public health, we had economics, and we had rights. First, you identified which team won the rights issue, which team won the economics issue, and which team won the public health issue. But now you're identifying for the judge, or to yourself at this point, which one of those issues is the most important, least important, and so forth. And then you encapsulate the arguments and the contributions of all of the debaters who came before you underneath those central questions. So you actually then break your speech down into 2 or 3 questions as your areas of analysis, and then show us through the different speeches in the debate round which team won those arguments and why those arguments were the most or least important issues in the debate. So in terms of propositions, take for example, and I'm borrowing this from my old boss at the University of Alaska Anchorage, Steve Johnson, but you could have a debate that talks about banning tobacco products, and that is the main proposition that you're debating. Should we ban tobacco products? And you can have pro ground and con ground, and you're going to engage in a clash. You're going to engage in debate. Again, I already gave you these 3. The issue questions that may have been debated in the hypothetical debate round are, is smoking detrimental to public health? Will the ban have economic consequences? And do smokers have a right to smoke in public? And we debated on each of those 3 issues. In a hypothetical world, then you could explain for the judge which team won each of those issues and why. But then you also have vertical debate. where you explain in the whip speech why this issue is the most important issue and other issues are less important issues. And so in the tobacco example, you could imagine or envision a debate that would look something like this slide, where the public health issue was won by the pro side, and the pro side made that the most important issue in the debate. Economics was won by the con side, but was a very relatively small portion of the debate. And then finally, the smokers' rights was won by the con, but was only slightly more significant than economic consequences. So here in this particular scenario, we can see that the con team won 2 of the issue questions, but it looks like pro is probably the winner of the debate because the central issue to the debate is actually the public health question. So to go back to our debate, the opposition whip might come up with 2 central questions. Does violence beget violence? And second, what best leads to social harmony? Or alternatively, a separate question could be, will students internalize the principles of justice or learn to fear the system? Those 2 summary questions capture everything that was debated by the 6 speeches that came before the opposition whip. So you can capture the entire debate around those 2 areas of analysis. The proposition whip will need to engage in some deconstruction. Why? Because the third opposition speaker had this balancing strategy, so you might need to go back and deal with a flawed assumption or something like that. But primarily during this 4-minute speech, you're going to summarize the debate. In this particular case, we can imagine 2 questions. Does corporal punishment lead to violence or a safe learning environment? And 2, who best promotes justice in our society? Again, those are the 2 areas of analysis that are discussed in the whip speech by the proposition whip speech. You encapsulate all of the arguments in the debate round under those 2 questions. You can see those 2 questions are fairly similar to the opposition whip's questions, but they're written slightly differently so that it gets you thinking in ways that are probably going to lead the judge to conclude with the proposition side. And same for the opposition. Those questions are crafted in ways that get you thinking about why we should reject the proposition. But of course, then you're going to show how the argument works out in your favor during your speech. So that is a complete World Schools debate round, showing you what each speaker is going to accomplish, how they might do it, and so forth.